All right, so we've talked about evangelicals already, and the rise of evangelicals and some of the things that make them, what we call them. What does it mean to be Victorian? Does it have any resonance with you? It sure doesn't with me, so I'd be super surprised if it really meant anything determinate for you. Does anybody have any sort of sense about what it might mean to be Victorian? Yeah.
In my women's studies minor, we talked about how, when it comes to gender, the separate spheres doctrine for men and women really developed during the Victorian age. But that's what the word seems to remind me of.
That's a part of this. That's a very important part of this. Mainly it's something having to do with middle class and upper class, right? Because the working class women still had to be out in the workplace working the same sort of crappy jobs that a lot of the men did. But you're right, in the Victorian age, there's a very strong separation of the genders. So women are more and more being confined to the space of the home, and men are out in the workplace. That's one of the central ideas. Oftentimes we associate Victorianism with a kind of moral prudishness, a kind of squeamishness about sexuality, about conflict, about all sorts of things. Victorians are seen as being sort of like the modern day Puritans. And that, there's some justice to that, but not complete. This era was actually quite a ferment, as your book points out. It's a time of urbanization. Urbanization means that people are moving away from sort of settled countryside living where things moved a bit slower into cities. And what happens when you put people in cities? You have a lot of new things happening, a lot of things breaking down. This is a process that's still going on today in some parts of the world. Your book also mentions Prohibition, which we're going to talk about quite a bit. Now, one of the things that you associate with the Victorian age is reformism. Before the Civil War, one of the huge reform issues was anti-slavery, right? Makes sense. That's part of what brought about the Civil War. After the Civil War, some of those energies get channeled into Reconstruction, into trying to alleviate the plight of the blacks in the South, which was pretty terrible, because the white Southerners were not particularly happy about losing the war and dragged their heels on just about everything. But that sort of faded out after a while. There were other things, like it says, most white evangelicals turn their attention elsewhere. So where did they turn their attention? This thing about gender roles is an issue. Gender roles, and sort of split. Women being confined to the household, the home, men, world of work, the marketplace, all those business, the professions, all of that. The poor, like it says in both sexes, were still consigned to hard physical work. So you've got a public versus private dichotomy developing, right? Where do the churches fit in with this? Your book asks. Well, the church is kind of a blurred lines type of place. Why? Church leadership is primarily male, but who's really actively involved in the churches? It's women. And the churches occupy kind of a weird, in-between land. He says, the role of organized religion was becoming confused in terms of the dichotomies that were shaping the way many churchgoers organized their perceptions of reality. If society could be divided into dichotomous, meaning separate zones, what was the place of the church? And there it starts talking about this guy who contributes to these blurred lines, Dwight Moody. Dwight Moody is the father of modern revivalism. And Moody sets up shop in Chicago. As a matter of fact, there's still a Moody Bible School in Chicago that runs radio shows and does all sorts of outreach. He teams up with this guy, Sankey, who's a musician and songwriter. And these revivals were sort of bringing together, the public, the business, together. How so? Well, before he shows up on the scene, he insists that the entire ground be prepared. There has to be a committee of clergy and laity that erect a tabernacle, a huge tent for the people that are going to be engaging in the revival. They use modern methods of advertising and publicity. So, what would that be at that time? The newspapers, for example. That was, again, something quite different. To see a newspaper ad show up to this revival. People weren't doing that before that time. A lot of the wealthiest businessmen were admirers of his. And so, like it says, his message was very much in harmony with the masculine world of commerce and industry and served its interest in the lack of disturbing social and political implications. What's his message? His message is very, very simple. Here's the book's summary of it. It could be reduced to the proposition that salvation was available for the asking. All the sinner had to do to obtain salvation was to make a simple decision, symbolized in hitting the sawdust trail, which was the framework that he used. Sawdust was what you'd throw down at that time, so that it would, you didn't have hardwood floors and these outdoor things. It would keep things clean. So hitting the sawdust trail meant, coming up to the front in the altar call and saying, yes, I'm going to live a new life. So it says, instead of theological reflection, his sermons were anecdotal, usually pathetic stories involving premature death, longing for mother, and a gentle Jesus whose message of redemption was open to all. Judgment was gone, mercy was everything. So, what he's teaching is, all you have to do is open up your heart, not your mind, your heart, and let God in, and everything will be okay from that point on. That's what's going on in these revivals. That's the theology. They're also revolutionizing things by using music in a very different way. They start writing all sorts of songs, a whole new genre called gospel hymns. Like your book points out, don't confuse that with the African-American gospel music of the South. It's something different. These were hymns sort of designed to tug at your heartstrings, to get you to feel a certain way. And they would do this to warm up the audience. Again, a new thing. The idea was to soften them up so you could make these sentimental appeals. So, your book talks about a cult of powerlessness going along with this. That's actually such a good phrase, I'll put it on the board. What does that mean? It means that the victims, the marginalized, the one down, become the ones who actually have the social power, although in real life they're still just as alienated, just as one down, just as subordinate as they were. Now, like your book points out, not all Victorian women were content with this sort of trade-off. The Reform Crusades provided women with an opportunity to actually get involved, not just in organizations, but in politics. Remember, this public world, as the province of men, is excluding women from politics. Women can't vote at this time either. That's one of the movements, the reform movements that comes about. So one way for women to actually get very actively involved in politics is through some more dynamic reform movements, not through revivals, but through actual reform. And one of the biggest ones that captures the imagination is what's called the Temperance Movement. So what's the Temperance Movement? What does it involve? When you hear this word temperance, does that still have any resonances with you? I know I talk about this in my ethics classes. We talk about the virtue of temperance. Does this mean anything today? We don't use this word very much, do we? So in the past, even for my generation, we didn't use this word much. I think for maybe my parents' generation, your grandparents' generation, it would still have resonances of being tied to alcohol. Is that the right way to spell it? Alcohol? I always misspell alcohol. Temperance originally meant like moderation. And Christianity was not necessarily anti-alcohol. As a matter of fact, if you think about what was the first miracle Jesus is supposed to have done, he didn't do it, because he wanted to. His mom kind of, got on his case till he did it. What was it?
Water the wine.
Yeah, exactly. So it's hard to make the case that Christianity is necessarily against alcohol when you've got this guy turning water into wine at a wedding feast. And a lot of Christians actually drank quite a bit at that time. Your book has an interesting statistic here. It says, between 1790 and 1840, the average male citizen drank about half a pint of hard liquor a day. So what's a half a pint? It's like one of those little flasks. You know how many shots are in half a pint? It's about 5 shots. So imagine that the average guy is drinking about 5 shots of liquor. Not beer, not wine, 5 shots of hard liquor a day. Every day. Some days more, some days less. Maybe some guy over here only drinks 2. That means some guy over here is drinking 8. Some guy over here doesn't drink any. Some guy's drinking a whole pint a day. That's a lot of drinking taking place, right?
Not
So,
that much.
what's that?
Not that much.
Not that much. I don't know. If you're doing it day in, day out, that gets pretty tough over time. I say this coming from a state that, led the nation in drinking at the time, Wisconsin. So. Brandy consumption, beer consumption, drinks in Wisconsin. I had to get a bartender's license to work at a gas station because you sold so much beer and wine at gas stations. And one of the things they taught us in bartending class, the 4-hour bartending class we had to go to, was drinks in Wisconsin were 1.5 times stronger than other places. People just put in more liquor, So even coming from there, I think that drinking half a pint a day is kind of a lot to drink. So now, like your book points out, temperance didn't originally mean getting rid of alcohol altogether, but that became an absolutist position. And this notion of taking the pledge becomes what temperance is about. Taking the pledge to what? To not to drink, to swear off demon rum. And it became, like your book points out, this quintessential American reform movement because everybody could get behind it. Everybody could get behind it for various reasons. It could be because, you just don't like people who drink that much. It could be because it makes you look good. It could be because, you wanted to change society. And drinking, really can interfere with society quite a bit. It could be revenge against, the male sex because it was mostly identified with men. So a lot of people could get behind it. And one of the big organizations is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Eventually it gets led by this woman, Frances Willard. And Willard was a real firebrand. She had this whole program. She wanted not only to shut down saloons, but she campaigned for women's interests in areas of labor, prisons, prostitution, drugs, health. You think about all these different areas. So, Willard was one of the key organizers. She also campaigned for women's suffrage. And this is the organization that really gets the ball rolling on the temperance movement. Later on, they get sort of overshadowed by the anti-saloon league. And your book spends a little bit of time talking about this word saloon. When we think of saloon, what do we think of? I'm going to the saloon. Must be like an Old West kind of town. It's probably got swinging doors, That that's not all saloons were. Saloons were the sort of urban institution where you'd go to drink. Another word for it would be tavern. Tavern is a place where you go basically to drink with your buddies after work. Maybe you'll have a meal, maybe not. Maybe your meal will just be liquid. And it got associated with all these sort of unsavory elements of urban life. Like I said, it represented all the social forces that stood against everything rural evangelicals and urban progressives had in common. So they talk about this as sort of tied together with the anti-Catholicism of the time. And anti-Catholicism was on the rise. Why? Not only were Protestants, because they were Protestants, going to be against Catholics, there were all these massive waves of immigration that were taking place. And if your view of America is that it's a primarily Protestant nation, and you've got all these people coming in who are, in your view, of a different religion, you're not going to like that. You're going to see that as a dilution of your national character. And a lot of these Catholic nationalities are congregating in the cities, because urbanism is a big concern at the time. They're not going out to the countryside so much. So the anti-saloon movement is kind of tied in with this as well. Like it says, the saloon helped perpetuate immigrant culture, reinforce Catholic mores. It robbed the working man of his wages, sobriety, health, usefulness to his family and employer. It served as a den for crime of all sorts. It served as a convenient basis for corrupt urban machine politics. It was a symbol of everything that the better classes wanted to get rid of. So what does this ultimately lead to? What we call Prohibition. The 18th Amendment. Yeah, of course, none of us even know anybody at this point old enough to really remember an awful lot about Prohibition, because that generation is dying out. I had a great uncle, the oldest of my great uncles. He was actually a booze runner from Canada. He would bring down stuff across the border. We had a sports car and could outrun the cops. That was part of Prohibition. It's got all this glamorous stuff around cops and robbers. Why did all that come about? Because they told people you can't drink anymore. The entire nation is going to be dry. They managed to pass a constitutional amendment that outlawed alcohol all across the board. That took a massive amount of consensus among voters. When you talk about bipartisan issues, to pass a constitutional amendment, that's a lot of work. You can only do that when you've got everybody behind you, more or less. And the way that they were able to do this was by mobilizing evangelicals. This was the last major issue that evangelical Protestants were able to all get on board with. Protestants in general were able to. It was not just we often think of like being against liquor and stuff like that as a conservative thing, but this is really much more a liberal progressive thing. It was the Methodists who were leading the charge, and it was seen as sort of a way to make sure that you could take care of the people who would be put out by alcohol, the poor, the working class. You could make sure that they didn't blow all their money on booze, and reinforce a moral nation. So your book then talks about what happens after this. How well did Prohibition actually work out, given what you know about American history? What do you suspect, given that you can walk down the street and go to a bar?
It didn't last.
Yeah, I mean, you've all seen the gangster movies. It starts organized crime or contributes to it more. It actually has to be repealed by the 20th Amendment. Now we regulate alcohol, but we don't ban it altogether. This is the last, like I said, this is the last thing that they can actually get all on the same page with. Protestantism divides now into camps. this. It isn't so far away from it. Protestantism in America divides into two camps. And you can understand these as liberal or modernist. And we get a new word coming in. What's going on in culture at the time that produces this split? Well, a couple different things. So I'll put like the dividing stuff in here. What do you associate this guy, Charles Darwin, with? Let me write that. Turtles, I know, because he went to the Galapagos, but finches. What's his real big thing?
Survival of the fittest.
And what is that coming from?
Evolution.
Very good. So Darwinian evolution. He's not the first guy to talk about evolution. Evolution. By the way, plenty of people hundreds of years before him already, thinking in evolutionary terms. But he's a guy who actually goes out and does some scientific work and says, here's what I observed, with these finches. Here's what I've observed with these turtles. Then he has a book about man, about human beings. And he says that we're descended from the apes. And that threw a lot of people. Because if that's true, what can't be true? Something that these Protestants want to hold on to. Yeah, like not by taking an ape and monkeying around. It's kind of a pun, monkeying around. But you gotta watch out for the language sometimes, right? But just like taking clay and blowing into it and saying, "There you go, Adam." So that literal story in the Bible, if Darwin is right, that can't be literally true. And a lot of people at that time are saying it is literally true. So this is going to be a big problem. Another thing that's going on is what we call modern biblical criticism. Many people's views of the Bible are that it sort of like fell into human beings' hands directly from the mouth of God. What we know is that it couldn't be like that because some of the books, are written earlier, some of the books are written later. Sometimes they refer to books that we no longer have. If you read the books of Kings, you'll see the authors say, oh, by the way, if you want to hear more about this king, go read the book over here, which we don't have anymore. So we know that there's been a history of development. Modern biblical criticism means looking at the texts not as necessarily divinely inspired, but as literature that we can know something about, that we can apply techniques to figure out whether, this part was written first and this part was written later. Here's one example of this. The book of Isaiah is one of the longest books of the Bible, and it's named after this guy, Isaiah. And so for a long time, everybody thought Isaiah wrote it. Well, if you do careful textual analysis of it, it's probably got at least 2 or 3 different writers. One guy wrote the first part, then another guy, or perhaps a committee, wrote the second part, and then another guy wrote the third part. And these were probably written at different times, and then put together as one thing. And one way that you can make sense of this is actually by saying there was an entire school of Isaiah. And one of the things that you've often found in ancient literature was if you belonged to a particular school, you would just attribute the founder of the school with your writings. This happened all the time. But that's something that you would bring in because of biblical criticism. Again, if you think of the Bible as being the Word of God coming directly as revelation, like God is like whispering into the writer's ear as he's writing things down, that's not going to fly with you. You're not going to be okay with that. And this is one of the things that's going to separate liberal or modernist Christians who tend to be okay with that sort of thing. And they'll say, there's development. There's growth. There is a focus on the human, as opposed to the fundamentalists who are saying, no, there are some things that have to be, seen literally. So this is involving a literal reading of Scripture. There's more involved in being a fundamentalist than that. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later on, I think, when we get to that. This is going to lead to what the book calls the Second Disestablishment. This split. We're going to look at this split a bit more carefully in later chapters. All right, so we got the Second Disestablishment. When was the first disestablishment? Right after the Revolution, right? No more state churches. Everybody has to sort of compete for adherence, for believers. You have to have something to bring to the table or else nobody's going to go to your church. The Second Disestablishment is taking place in part because of the split between Protestants. So they can't get on the same page anymore over things, over social issues, the way that they used to with Prohibition. There's other things that are happening too. Pluralism. Pluralism occurring through immigration. This is part of what I was talking about before. Catholics, Orthodox, Jews, they were marginalized before. They were seen as the other. They're not part of the culture. Because the culture was essentially dominated by Protestant Christians. As they're becoming a larger and larger part of America, their voices are now becoming part of the history. They're becoming part of the narrative. More and more, the Protestants end up getting marginalized. Not really marginalized, but in their own view, they see it as they're losing their sort of role. Another thing was what you can call secularism. But instead of saying secularism, I'll say secularity, meaning an emphasis on the non-religious. And your book has these great examples. A lot of times, like I said, people would go to revivals, because revivals were where you would get excited. That's what people were into. Billy Sunday actually turned revivals into something almost like vaudeville. He gets eclipsed by what? By sports, by entertainment. And these illustrate, like the book says, the power of secular mass culture, the radio, tabloids, newspapers, films. All that part is part of sort of a secular life that doesn't have much to do with religion. Now, think about today's radio and TV. Do you have religious networks? Sure. You can listen to Catholic radio or Seventh-day Adventist radio, or you can watch, various religious networks. How many of you ever watched that stuff? Do you find it entertaining? When you want, gripping dramas, do you turn to the Bible channel? There's cool stories in the Bible, A lot of the stories that you look at today are actually just taking biblical stories and kind of gussying them up and changing the names, and they're great stories. But do we go to these religious channels for the most part for our entertainment? Not really. And we do have some people talking about religion in terms of sports, don't we? They credit Jesus for their touchdown or for their tackle or things like that. But for the most part, sports is pretty disassociated from religion, isn't it? It's actually an old joke that if it's the Super Bowl, all the pastors have to make their sermon really short so everybody can get home to get ready for the Super Bowl. That shows you the tension there. There's another thing that's happening too. Social functions. What do we mean by these? Like welfare, taking care of the poor. social work, taking care of orphans, all those sorts of things. Those start becoming more a matter of the government and not so much a matter of where they were before, in the hands of churches. So that's part of what's leading to disestablishment. Another thing that your book talks about is issues of sexuality. There's a whole conversation that could be had about that. Questions of sexuality and sex roles preoccupied middle-class women and considerable numbers of men. You may not realize this, but the YMCA and the YWCA are coming out of those conversations in part. This Young Men's Christian Association. That's what YMCA stands for, and YWCA, Young Women's Christian Association. What was all that about? It was a way to sort of like have bodily purity, so that then you could have spiritual purity. Now we don't associate with that. I see some smirks out there. Probably because of the song YMCA, right? And one of the other things that's sort of an index of how far things go, how disestablished Protestants feel, you can tell that people are upset about not being in charge anymore when they start burning things or breaking things or going crazy. And the last thing that your book actually talks about in this chapter is the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was originally established in the American South, right? In the 1870s. And it disappears for quite a while. It revives in the 1920s and 1930s, to the point that they actually interfered with the national election. They kept Al Smith from getting elected because he was a Catholic candidate. Who was the Klan against? Who are the three groups that they were fundamentally opposed to? Anyone know? This isn't hard to figure out.
African American.
African Americans, that was the original group that they were targeting. Later on, it shifts its emphasis. African Americans, yeah.
Non-Protestants,
Non-Protestants, so who would that include?
lots of Catholics.
So Catholics, and then what other religious group would have, what's that?
Mormons.
They didn't like the Mormons, but at the time they're not really on the scene so much. Jews. The Klan was a sort of a nativist, resurgence, and that came out of this Second Disestablishment. It's sort of the dark side of it, you might say. And the 1920s Klan spent just as much time going after Catholics as they did going after African Americans or going after Jews. And why? Because they felt like all these things had taken away Protestant America. That's where we'll leave off.